let me start off with a fantasy I've had. It involves, well, I've overpowered his elite guard. I've fought my way into his secret bunker, and I've managed to knock his Luger out of his hand, his cyanide pill that he keeps to commit suicide rather than be captured. He snarls at me. He comes at me in a rage. We wrestle. I manage to pin him down, put handcuffs on him, and then say, Adolf Hitler, I arrest you for crimes against humanity. This is where the Medal of Honor version of this fantasy ends, and the imagery begins to darken. What would I do if I actually had Hitler in my hands? And it's not hard to imagine once I allow myself. Sever his spine. Oh, I don't know, can I? Is this on? Now it's on? Okay. So, not hard to imagine once I allow myself. Sever his spine at the neck. Take out his eyes with a blunt instrument, puncture his eardrums, cut out his tongue, leave him alive on a respirator, tube-fed, not able to move, not able to speak, not able to hear, to see, just to feel, and then inject him with something cancerous that will infest every single cell in his body. Now, I've had this fantasy since I was a kid, and I still do sometimes, and when I really think about it, my heart beats faster. And it's all these plans for like the most evil, wicked soul in history. Except there's a problem, which is I don't believe in souls, and I don't believe in evil, and I think wicked is only appropriate for a musical. But on the other hand, there's all sorts of people I wouldn't mind seeing killed, but I'm against the death penalty, but I watch all sorts of violent, schlocky movies, but I'm for very strict gun control. But then there was this one time I was in a laser tag place, and I had such a good time hiding in a corner, shooting at people over and over, until this, pimply kid zapped me 1,000,000 times in a row and then snickered at me and made me feel very unmanly. So essentially what is obvious here is I'm your typical human when it comes to this extremely confusing topic of violence. Now, obviously, as a species, we have problems with violence. We have used shower heads to deliver poison gas, letters with anthrax, passenger planes as weapons, mass rape as a military strategy. We are a miserably violent species. But there's a complication with that, which is we don't hate violence. We hate the wrong kind of violence, because when it's the right kind, we leap in, we pay good money to watch it, we hand out medals, we vote for, we mate with the people who are masters at it. When it's the right kind of violence, we love it. And there's an additional complication, because amid us being this miserably violent species, we're also a extraordinarily compassionate and altruistic one. So how do you begin to make sense of us, the biology of us at our best moments and our worst moments and all those ambiguous ones in between? Now, one thing that is clear is it is utterly boring to understand the biology of the motoric aspects of your behavior. Your brain tells your spine, tells your muscles to do something, and hooray, you've behaved. What's incredibly complicated is understanding the meaning of the behavior. Because in one setting, firing a gun is some appalling act, and in another, it's an act of heroic self-sacrifice. In one setting, putting your hand on top of someone else's is deeply compassionate. In another, it's a deep betrayal. The challenge for us is to understand the biology of the context of our behaviors. And that one is really, really challenging. And one thing that's clear is you are never going to really understand what's going on if you get it into your head that you're going to be able to explain everything with this is the part of the brain or the gene or the hormone or the childhood experience or the evolutionary mechanism that explains everything, because it doesn't work that way. Instead, any behavior that occurs is the outcome of the biology that occurred a second before, and an hour before, and all the way to 1,000,000 years before. Okay, so to give you some sense of this, okay, so you're in some situation, there's a crisis, there's rioting, violence going on, people running around, and there's a stranger running at you in an agitated state. And you can't quite be sure what their facial expression is. Maybe they're angry, maybe they're frightened, maybe it's threatening. They've got something in their hand that seems like a handgun, and you're standing there and you have a gun, and they come running at you and you shoot. And then it turns out that what they had in their hand was a cell phone instead. And thus we ask a biological question: why did that behavior occur in you? And what's really the central point is, that's a whole hierarchy of questions. Why did that behavior occur? What went on 1 second before in your brain that brought about that behavior? Now, to begin to understand that, the part of the brain that's at the top of the list of usual suspects is a brain region called the amygdala. You want to think about aggression and think about the brain, you think about the amygdala. If you stimulate the amygdala in an experimental lab animal, you get an outburst of aggression. Humans who have rare types of seizures that start there, rare types of tumors based on the amygdala, uncontrollable violence. If you damage the amygdala, you blunt the ability of an organism to be aggressive. Okay, so the amygdala is about violence. Except, if you sit down your typical amygdalologist and ask them what the amygdala is about, that's not the first word that's going to come out of their mouths. Because for most people studying it, what the amygdala is about is fear. Fear and anxiety and learning to be afraid. In other words, we've just learned something very interesting, which is you cannot understand the first thing about the neurobiology of violence without understanding the neurobiology of fear. And a world in which no amygdaloid neuron need be afraid, there'd be an awful lot more of us sleeping between lions and lambs. Now, the thing to begin to make sense of with the amygdala is, what parts of the brain does it talk to, and which regions talks to it in turn. Now, next region that is incredibly interesting is called the Insular Cortex. Now, the insular cortex is in fact incredibly boring if you're a lab rat or any other mammal on Earth, because it does something very straightforward. You bite into a piece of food and it's spoiled and rotten and fetid and rancid and all of that. And what happens is, as a result, your insular cortex activates. And it triggers all sorts of reflexes. Your stomach lurches, you gag, you spit it out, you have a gag reflex. Very useful. It keeps mammals from eating poisonous foods. And you do the same thing with human. Get a nice human volunteer who inexplicably is convinced to bite into this food that's rancid and disgusting, and they're in a brain scanner and their insular cortex activates. We do something fancier. All we have to do is think about eating something disgusting, and the insular cortex activates. But then something much more subtle. Sit down someone in your brain scanner and have them tell you about a time they did something miserable and rotten to some other human. Or tell them about some other occurrence of some human doing something miserable and rotten to somebody else, and the insular cortex will activate. In every other mammal on Earth, it does gustatory disgust. But in us, it also does moral disgust. And what that tells you is why it is if something is sufficiently morally appalling, we feel sick to our stomachs. It leaves a bad taste in our mouths. We feel soiled by it. We feel nauseous. Because our brain invented this symbolic thing of mores and standards some 40, 50,000 years ago, and didn't invent a new part of the brain at the time. And instead, there was presumably some sort of big committee meeting, and they said, okay, moral disgust, there's there's that insular that does like food disgust, or okay, it's in their portfolio now. Give me some duct tape. The insular cortex is now going to do moral disgust as well, and it has trouble telling the difference. And no surprise, the main part of the brain the insular cortex talks to in the human brain is the amygdala, because once it decides this thing is disgusting, you're a couple of steps away from it being scary, it being menacing, it being something you need to act against. Now, in lots of ways, it's very cool the insular cortex does this, because suppose you see some moral ill that needs to be cured, and some of the time that can take enormous self-sacrifice. That could take the ultimate sacrifice in some cases. And if moral outrage was this abstraction, this sort of distanced sort of state, it would be hard to pick up a head of steam to really be able to act against it. The viscera, your stomach churning, that's where the force comes to make a moral imperative. That's great. But then there's a downside, because the insular cortex is not very good at remembering it's only a metaphor that you were feeling disgusted. And suddenly you have that whole problem of the world of people who are disgusted by somebody's behavior, which in somebody else's eyes is just a normal, loving lifestyle. Disgust is a moving target in time and space. And there's the danger to decide that being morally disgusted by something is a pretty good litmus test for deciding between right and wrong. And we sure know all the ways in which that can get you into trouble. And probably most of all, every ideologue in history has had a brilliant intuitive feeling for how the insular cortex works, which is if you can get your minion to the point that when you talk about them living in the next valley, them who think differently than you, who pray differently, who love differently, if you can get your followers to the point that when you invoke them, insular cortex activate because there's something just disgusting about them, you're 90% of the way towards pulling off your successful genocide. A key to every good sort of genocidal movement is taking them and turning them into being such infestations and malignancies and whatevers that they hardly even count as human anymore. Okay, so we've got this sort of axis between the insular cortex and the amygdala. Meanwhile, we've got the most interesting part of the brain, far and away, a region called the frontal cortex. Frontal cortex, I've just wasted the last 35 years of my life studying a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is kind of interesting and like it's done well by me, and I've been, that sort of, but I wish I'd been studying the frontal cortex. It's the most recently evolved part of the human brain. We've got more of it than any other species on Earth. And what does it do? The frontal cortex makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. And impulse control and gratification postponement and long-term planning and emotional regulation. And what does the frontal cortex spend an awful lot of time doing? Sending inhibitory projections down to the amygdala, hoping to race there in time to say, wait a second, are you sure that's really a handgun? Wait a second, I wouldn't do that if I were you. I know this seems like a brilliant idea right now, but believe me, you are going to regret it. The frontal cortex very often racing to try to control the amygdala. Now, there's this picture of the frontal cortex. All it does is occasionally go slumming down the amygdala and preach to it about like temperance or whatever. But in fact, there's bidirectionality. The amygdala has plenty means to talk to the frontal cortex. What's that about? Every time we're in a moment of extreme aroused state and we make a decision that is hideously stupid and disastrous that seems brilliant at the time, because that's the frontal cortex being marinated in what's down below. In other words, there's this very tempting view that the frontal cortex most recently evolved. It's this gleaming, shining, computer-like part of our brain. It's sitting there just marinating in all the emotive yuck going on underneath. It's bidirectional communication. Now, finally, in terms of making sense of this frontal cortex, the whole notion of doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do is a value-free judgment. What do I mean by this? Sometimes you have to have an incredibly strong, aerobically studly frontal cortex to resist the temptation to lie. And that's at the centerpiece of some of the most important sort of crossroads in our lives. However, once you decide that you are going to lie, you need your frontal cortex to do it effectively, because it's your frontal cortex that says, okay, remember, don't make eye contact, don't use this right cheek muscle at that point because you're going to be tempted to twitch, keep your voice under control. It could take an enormous amount of discipline to go and effectively, make the world whole and a better place, but it can also take an awful lot of discipline and staying up late and studying to be effective at ethnically cleansing villages. The frontal cortex is value-free in that sense. Okay, so we've gotten a sense of a couple of the brain regions here that are pertinent. So that's what's going on in 1 second before. But no brain is an island, and what we now have to do is take a step back. So what was going on in the seconds to minutes before in the sensory environment which triggered that amygdala to do this or that frontal cortex to do that? What are the stimuli that are coming in there? Now, obviously, in this scenario, we have the sight, the sounds of this rioting perfectly pertinent to making sense there. But then there's a whole world of sensory stuff going on that's subliminal, that you hardly even know is there, and if you did, not in a million years would you think it's pertinent. For example, when you have to make split-second decisions, you are more likely to mistake a cell phone for a handgun if the person holding it is male, is large, is of another race. Your brain processes that in 50 milliseconds. That is 1/20th of a second. Your brain is already distinguishing that incorrectly. Why is that? That turned out to have a really interesting piece of the wiring of the amygdala. Okay, so suppose you look at somebody and there's something in their hand that's either a cell phone or a handgun. So what happens? The information goes from your eye to this way station in the brain and eventually gets to your visual cortex. And a first layer there sits and spends some time and figures out what the pixels are. And then the second layer turns the pixels into lines. And then the next layer turns the lines into curves. And eventually you got a four-dimensional sort of picture of whatever, and then eventually some neurons in your cortex says, oh my, I believe that's a handgun, and let's go wake up the amygdala and let it know about it. That's the simple part. It turns out there's a shortcut, the very first way station where sensory information comes in, shortcuts directly to the amygdala. In other words, the amygdala knows there's a handgun while your visual cortex is still futzing around with the pixels there. That's very good. That's very helpful that it gets that information quickly, but it turns out you need all those computational layers in your visual cortex to tell what's there accurately. In other words, the amygdala gets sensory information that's very emotionally aroused before your conscious cortex does, and the accuracy is not great. And thus, if you're tired, if you're hungry, if you're in pain, if there's a bad smell around, if any of those things are happening, you are biasing the amygdala towards mistaking a neutral facial expression for a threatening one. Mistaking a cell phone for a handgun, all of that occurring in the seconds before. Okay, but now we need to take a step further back. What about hours to days before? How was that affecting how sensitive you are to sensory information, which then talks to your amygdala and insular cortex, all of that? What we've moved into here is the realm of hormones. In that regard, amid a gazillion hormones that are pertinent, two of them stand out above all others. First one, the inevitable usual suspect hormone that's got to be pulled in at this point, which is testosterone. Okay, what is testosterone about? Testosterone is the reason why males in every culture and every species on Earth are such pains in the asses. Testosterone does not cause aggression. What testosterone does is bias you towards interpreting ambiguous social information as being threatening, as being provocative. Take somebody and pump them up with testosterone, and they decide that neutral facial expressions seen for a 20th of a second are threatening. Take testosterone and that brief exposure to that neutral facial expression, and suddenly the amygdala is all agitated and frothing at the mouth. What testosterone does is it exaggerates pre-existing tendencies. What it does is sensitize you to whatever social learning you've received about what kind of aggression is just fine and what kind isn't. Now, the single most interesting thing about testosterone is even that's not what it really does. Testosterone doesn't make organisms more aggressive. What testosterone does is it makes more organisms more likely to do whatever behavior is needed to hold on to high status when it's being challenged. Okay, if you're a baboon, what that means is aggression, because if somebody's threatening you, it's going to be all about aggression. That's the entire world of the baboon. Remarkably, in humans, put somebody in an economic game where you get high status by being generous in the offers you make, and testosterone makes people more generous. The problem isn't that testosterone causes aggression. The problem is that we reward aggression with status so readily. And what that also tells you is if you took a gazillion Buddhist monks and shot them up with testosterone, they'd be running around in like frenzied gangs doing random acts of kindness to see who could do the most of them most quickly. The problem here is not the hormone, it's the values and the rewards that we place on aggression. Okay, meanwhile, in that span of hours to days, the other hormone that has just as undeserved of a reputation, but in the opposite direction, is this hormone oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is officially, to sort of use endocrine jargon, it's officially the grooviest hormone on earth, because oxytocin's by now famous. It causes bonding between mothers and infants and pair bonding between monogamous couples, and it makes you more expressive and emotionally sensitive and more cooperative and more charitable and more trusting. And there's a whole new horrifying field of neuroscience called Neuro Marketing, where if you spritz oxytocin up people's noses, they're more likely to believe all sorts of gibberish and nonsense of people trying to sell you stuff, whether it's their political viewpoint or some gewgaw. I mean, if they could spray oxytocin through the vents in like Costco all over this country, what that would do to the economy of like sort of the nonsense that people would buy. Okay, so oxytocin promotes pro-social behavior until you look more closely. And what recent work shows is that's exactly what oxytocin does. It makes you much more cooperative and generous and charitable and all of that with people who you categorize as being just like you. It makes you more pro-social towards in-group members. And when it comes to out-group members, it makes people more xenophobic and more preemptively aggressive and less cooperative. And the greatest study showing this was a couple of years ago. And this was a group in the Netherlands where they got their usual sort of lab rats, which was college volunteers from some like university there. And what they did was they gave everyone the standard classic problem in philosophy, the runaway trolley problem. Is it okay to sacrifice one person, push him in front of a runaway trolley to save 5? And there's a whole world of research done on that. So they sort of established the baseline levels at which people would be willing to push somebody to save 5. Now what they did was they gave the person they were pushing onto the track a name. A third of the time, the person would get a name that apparently is just like your stereotypical Dutch name, Dirk or Peter or something like that. A third of the time, or the remainder of the time, either of the two groups that people in Holland tend to have a lot of out-group hostility towards. Germans, oh that's right, World War II, or people with Muslim names. So now you've got the scenario, do you push Dirk in front of the trolley? Do you push Otto in front of the trolley? Do you push Mahmoud in front of the trolley? And what they show is, give people oxytocin, and they're less likely to sacrifice Dirk, whereas they can't leap fast enough to push Wolfgang and Ahmud. They're under the tracks. Oxytocin doesn't make us nicer. It makes us nicer to people we're already predisposed towards being nice to. It exaggerates us-them contrasts. Okay, so now stepping back further, how about weeks to months before? And this has now entered the realm of neuroplasticity, the fact that the brain can change in response to experience. And for example, if you've now just spent these last few months mired in trauma and stress, your amygdala will have grown larger. It will have formed new connections. The circuits there will be more excitable, and your frontal cortex will have become more sluggish and atrophied. In other words, at that critical moment, the amygdala is in a more hysterical, hyper-reactive state, and the frontal cortex has that much less capacity to get there in time and say, wait a second, are you sure before you pull the trigger there? You can see that changing. Okay, but stepping back even further, now going back years, decades, how about adolescence? What going on in adolescence is relevant now to this 1 second of whether or not you're going to pull that trigger. And the central fact of the adolescent brain is that all of the brain is going full blast, fully mature, except for the frontal cortex, which is still half-baked at that point. Amazingly, the frontal cortex, it's the last part of the brain to fully mature. It is not fully online until you are about 25 years old, which explains an enormous amount of freshman year in college. It's the last part of the brain to fully mature. What does that mean? It means adolescence and early adulthood is the time of life where environment and experience are sculpting your frontal cortex into the adult version you are going to have in that one critical moment there, deciding what the outcome is. What that also tells you is, if this is the last part of the brain to fully mature, it's the part of the brain least shaped by genes and most shaped by environment. Okay, but now stepping even further back, how about back to your childhood, back to your fetal life? Obviously pertinent, because that's when your brain was being constructed. But what people also have learned in recent years is experience during that period causes changes. Jargon in the field, epigenetic changes, causes permanent changes in some genes and parts of your body are turned on forever after. Other genes are turned off for lifetime consequences. In other words, childhood matters. This is one of the molecular mechanisms by which childhood matters. And as a very pertinent example of that, if you have spent your fetal 9 months being just bathed in high levels of stress hormones from mom's circulation because she is extremely stressed, as an adult, thanks to epigenetic changes during your fetal life, your amygdala is going to be hyperreactive. And you're going to secrete higher levels of stress hormones, which makes the amygdala even more reactive and makes the frontal cortex sluggish. So events back in fetal life. But going back even further, okay, back to when all you were was a fertilized egg and a bunch of genes. Now, obviously, genes have tons to do with everything here, but here is the great temptation to decide that genes are determining anything. Genes determine essentially nothing when it comes to behavior because genes work differently in different environments. And the most pertinent example here is a gene called monoamine oxidase A, MAOA. Do not even dream of writing that down. But MAOA comes in a bunch of different flavors, a bunch of different variants. And if you have one particular variant, you are very significantly more likely as an adult to commit antisocial violence. If and only if you were abused as a child. If you weren't, having that gene variant has zero increase in your risk factor. It's not your genes, it's the way the genes interact with your environment. And thus, starting with fetal life, the interactions between genes and environment are going to shape enormously what state your brain is in that one critical second now of do you pull the trigger or not. Okay. But you got to go even further back, past you as a single organism. How about your ancestors? What were they up to? For example, if your ancestors were pastoralists, people wandering deserts and grasslands with their herds of camels or cows or goats, the odds are they would have invented what is called a culture of honor. High levels of retributive violence, clan vendettas, warrior classes. That's the whole world of if they come and take your camel and you do nothing about it, the next day they'll come and take your entire herd and your wives and daughters too. Clan violence going on for centuries, and what is clear is if your ancestors were of a culture of honor centuries later, that's still influencing the values with which you were being raised, including within moments of birth, how often mothers are holding their children. So centuries worth of that. Okay, but steps further back, where are the cultural differences coming from? From ecosystems. One example of that. You look at people living in deserts, and historically, they're likely to come up with monotheistic religions. Look at people in rainforests, and they come up with polytheistic religions. Look at people in East Asia who live in flat plain areas, and they grow rice, which requires collectivist farming, and you get a very collectivist mindset about cooperation. Get people in the hill countries there, and they grow wheat, which is done in individual families, and you get the same individualistic mindset that you get in people living in Manhattan. All of it ecologically shaped. But then we got to go even further back, because if you're talking about genes anywhere along the way, you're talking about the evolution of the genes. And what you wind up seeing is evolution has sculpted different primate species into having different characteristic levels of aggression. Some primate species have virtually none. At another extreme, immensely high levels. And there's all sorts of biological traits that go along with the two extremes. And what about us? We're somewhere right in the middle between the two extremes. Okay, so in other words, if you want to understand why did this behavior occur, you've got to take into account everything from 1 second before to a million years before. Okay, so what do you conclude from that? Ooh, it's complicated. Okay, that's very useful, but how about, ooh, it's complicated, and you better be real careful and real cautious before you decide you understand the causes of a behavior, especially if it's behavior that you judge harshly, because things can really go wrong with the wrong attributions, and we have a very dark-stained history of that occurring precisely for those reasons. Now, for me, when I look at all of this information, the single thing that I find to be most important has to do with change. Every single biological fact that I've given along the way here is subject to change over time. Ecosystems change. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was a lush grassland filled with hippos and giraffe. Cultures change. In the 17th century, the scariest people in all of Europe were the Swedes, who spent that whole century rampaging all over Europe, and the Swedes have not had a war in 203 years. They changed. And most of all, brains change. Circuits form, neurons weaken, patterns grow, parts of brains expand, and as a result, people change, and they could change extraordinarily. Some examples of it. Change in people that can occur over the course of decades. A man who moves me enormously, a man by the name of John Newton. He was a British theologian. He was a leading abolitionist, played a central role in the banning of slavery at the beginning of the 1800s in England. John Newton spent the early decades of his adult life as the captain of a slave ship. And after he retired from that, he spent decades as a local parson still investing in the slave trade and growing rich from it until one day something changed in him. Something changed, and he celebrated it in the thing that he is most known for historically in a hymn that he wrote, Amazing Grace. Another example, a man named Zenji Abe, who on the morning of December 6th, 1941, was the lead pilot in one of the bombardier squadrons that took off from an Air Force base in Japan and attacked Pearl Harbor. He was one of their star pilots. He led one of the divisions there, and 50 years later to the day, as an old man, he came towards a ceremony at Pearl Harbor commemorating it. As an old man, came forward in broken English and apologized to some of the elderly survivors on the ground there, and spent the rest of his life close with some of them. Think about that transformation. If one of those men that he befriended had become a captive of his during World War II, he might have happily walked him to death in the Bataan Death March. And if he had been a captive of one of those American men who had killed him, he might very well have taken his skull as a souvenir, which was a standard thing done in the Pacific during World War II with dead Japanese. And instead, 50 years later, he's writing a letter to that man's grandchildren, consoling them when Grandpa has died. Change can occur even faster, over the course of hours. And the example that just mesmerizes me was the first winter of World War I, the Christmas truce of 1914. Powers that be had worked out a truce that was supposed to go for a couple of hours, and the idea was along the trenches of France, people would be able to come out and retrieve bodies from no man's land and go and bury them. So German and British troops came out and retrieved bodies. And soon they helped each other carry the bodies. And soon they helped each other dig graves in the frozen ground. And then they prayed together over the dead. And then they shared Christmas dinner, and then they exchanged gifts, and by the next day, they were playing soccer together up and down no man's land and exchanging addresses to get together and see each other after the war was over. And those truces went on for 2 to 3 days until the officers had to arrive and threatened to shoot these men unless they went back to killing each other. And all it took was a couple of hours to completely reorganize these people's sense of who counts as an us, as an a them, and us being all of us in these trenches on both sides, dying for no damn reason, and them being the faceless powers behind the lines, using us as just pawns. And sometimes change can occur in the course of seconds to minutes. Now, historically, probably the single biggest horror in terms of American consciousness from the Vietnam War was the Nilay Massacre. A brigade of American soldiers went into an undefended village full of civilians and killed between 350 and 500 of them, gang-raped women and girls beforehand, mutilated bodies, utterly nightmarish, because it occurred, because the U.S. government covered it up for as long as possible, because ultimately they just did slapping of a few wrists, and because it was not a singular incident, it was one of the nightmares of the Vietnam War. The Nilay Massacre was stopped by one man, a man named Hugh Thompson. Thompson was piloting a helicopter gunship, flying over the village, and was seeing American soldiers firing activity. Oh, they're under attack by Viet Cong, landed there, got out, and was viewing the incomprehensible sight of American soldiers shooting elderly women, digging out babies from underneath the bodies of their mothers and shooting them, and figured out what was happening. And Hugh Thompson got into his helicopter and in the course of minutes undid every bit of training he had had as to who is an us and who is a them. He took his helicopter, landed it between the last group of surviving villagers there and American soldiers coming at them with their weapons, landed his helicopter and turned his machine guns on the American soldiers and said, "If you do not stop, I will mow you all down." And what is most important to me is none of these guys had fancier neurons than any of us. Same neurotransmitters, same genes, same enzymes, no fancier than any of us. What I think we're left with here at the end is a version of like that inevitable, exasperating cliche, those who don't study history are destined to be able to repeat it. What we have here, I think, is the opposite. Those who don't study the history of extraordinary human change, and those who don't study the science of how we more readily go from the worst of our behaviors to the best ones, are destined not to be able to repeat unbelievable, magnificent moments like these. So let me stop at this point, and if there's any questions.